Hello, everyone. Welcome once again to a wonderful Wednesday webinar with the ever-growing climate emergency, climate resilience network of centres around the country. There's about 34 centres now reusing empty shops on the high street. We've got a big convergence this weekend of groups from all over the country coming to share their knowledge and wisdom about setting up these spaces, reaching out to the public all over and focusing on community-led solutions. But tonight we have a real treat for you. Tom Oliver. He's a Professor of Applied Ecology and Research on the Environment at the University of Reading, and he's the author of a book about nature solutions. He's going to tell us more in the presentation. So over to you, Tom. Thank you so much for coming over.
No, thank you for the invite. Yeah. So yeah, I'll press on. I've got a few slides where I'm going to cover four parts tonight. So hopefully lots of time for discussion at the end and prompt some interesting feedback, I hope. So firstly about systemic risks, and then thinking about the things that we're trying that aren't necessarily sufficient, kind of superficial solutions or sticking plaster fixes, and then trying to get down to the deeper solutions, which I believe, and actually many science policy institutions now suggest needs deeper kind of cultural shift. And then I'll kind of give a bit of an example at the end about one project which kind of follows on from that. So I guess to kick off, I mean, with this audience, I think everyone is kind of apprised of the urgency of the climate crisis. I was kind of surprised actually myself. I work in ecology, but I've looked at a lot of impacts of climate change and land use interacting on wildlife, on our bird and butterfly populations. But some meteorologists got in touch with me, and these are the kind of people who work on the Hadley Centre models that say up predictions of we're going to have 1.5 or 2 degrees given the current level of CO2 emissions. And I was really surprised because these guys are kind of mainstream in terms of they feed into the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change projections. But they were saying we don't think the IPCC is doing enough in terms of highlighting the risks that we face from climate change. I mean, the IPCC obviously have an impacts report. They talk about what happens if we hit 2 degrees and what will happen to ecosystems, what will happen to energy systems, what will happen to migration, human migration, etc. But I think that the point of the meteorologists, they were saying, well, these models predict kind of what's most likely under current circumstances. And as you probably heard, we're well on track for 2 degrees, maybe 3 or 4, which is catastrophic. But these risks don't. Sorry, the models don't think about in a risk assessment you kind of hope for the best, but you prepare for the worst. So really, we should be thinking about, okay, what's the sort of tail end of some of these models? And so, in terms of what could happen and what we should be preparing for, in terms of there's a couple of figures here of sort of direct impacts, but the impacts of heat waves on people, they build up over several nights, especially nighttime temperatures, and the body can't cool down and can lead to massive mortality. I mean, just this month, actually, temperatures in India, I think, were about 47 for days and days on end. And yeah, it's kind of intolerable. Flooding as well, large parts of London would be underwater under some of these high impact scenarios. But these were just the direct effects. And actually, what was also in the paper, which is a comment in the journal Nature, is that climate change interacts with many other systems, our food systems, not least, our energy and transport systems, damages to ecosystems, the nature, life support systems that keep us alive. So we were highlighting those kind of more complex cascading risks that come from climate change and the need for risk assessment to kind of properly understand those, because at the moment the IPCC just looks at mostly at direct impacts. And of course, it's not just climate change. Climate change is a major problem, but we've also got a kind of what's been called a polycrisis, and that this kind of term, which was less formal, is now entering some of the academic literature as well. This kind of entangled crises where you have demographic change, geopolitical disruption, trends like misinformation, ecosystem degradation, and kind of creating a perfect storm. And so, it's also important to think in that context that climate change is going on. And the word systemic risk is about how these risks kind of cascade across different systems. So this World Economic Forum projection here looks at social risks in the red, like inequality and declines in health and societal polarization. The green blobs, which are arguably probably too small here, about impacts of climate change, impacts of natural resource shortages, ecosystem disruption. And then there's other ones about misinformation, etc. But the idea is that these risks are interacting with each other, and they create systemic risks where these risks cascade across systems and create this disruption. So, initially the government has had its head in the sand a bit about this, but recently there is a bit of an upturn of activity about resilience building and a big focus on understanding these risks. There is an analysis called the National Risk Register, which looks at acute risks like, terrorist attack, pandemic, but there wasn't really a thinking about long-term risks. So I had a secondment with the Cabinet Office and Government Office for Science, where we kind of characterize what these long-term risks are, and how they interact with each other. And things like pollution, the PFAS in our rivers and air pollution, etc., weren't on that list. And I made a strong case to get them on there, so they're on there as now, which is good. But they're still very kind of light touch in terms of these reviews of risks. And now they're trying to say, well, what are departments doing? And are departments doing enough to build resilience to these risks? And more recently, actually, I had to come from a freedom of information request from Green Alliance, but the government have been working on with the intelligence services on this ecosystem collapse risk. So, if we lose major global ecosystems like Amazon forest dieback, what would that do in terms of geopolitical disruption, mass human displacement, impacts on food systems? And the government are now kind of thinking about that. And this report is published, at least a kind of redacted version is publicly available. But so government are taking this seriously and are trying to do as much as they can. But the reality is, we're not necessarily going to be well adapted enough just waiting for government to do what they need to do. Or for, we have a national adaptation plan for climate. Businesses are thinking about adaptation, but communities really need to think about this as well. In terms of addressing this polycrisis, what are we doing at the moment? I think there's a real dangerous tendency to focus on techno fixes. So if we've got a food crisis, we see food prices inflation, food prices shooting up. Maybe crops like tomatoes and raspberries, etc., get more expensive. Then people talk about having robotic pollinators these things can fly around greenhouses now and pollinate inside polytunnels, and they're controlled by a central computer, and they're getting smaller and smaller. But the problem is these robotic drones aren't going to pollinate all the wildflower plants that we have in our ecosystems. And if we lose those, we lose all the insects. And quite frankly, if we lose those, then we don't have a human civilization either. So, yes, these are clever, but there's a real opportunity cost in thinking that this is the solution to, say, the pollinator crisis. Similarly, the climate change, CO2 emissions in the atmosphere, there are people talking now about the UN and the UK have a funding agency which have just released another call on this now about geoengineering, which is trying to prevent solar radiation hitting the Earth. So ideas of kind of wacky ideas, putting mirrors in space, flying hundreds of planes, so we release aerosols which whiten the clouds and create this layer that reflects the sunlight, or dumping like iron filings or other particles into the sea, creating phytoplankton growth and absorbing carbon down. But each of these solutions, as it were, could have massive side effects, disrupting weather systems across the world, disrupting monsoons, food growing seasons, leading to massive, geopolitical disruption. And they kind of treat the whole earth as a kind of guinea pig in terms of whether they work or not. So this is a kind of last resort. But the problem is that, more people start talking about this, the more they start trialing these, the more it's easier for politicians to kind of kick the can down the road and say, well, CO2 emissions are a problem, but eventually we're going to be able to do this geoengineering or suck down the CO2 and store it under the sea or something. So that's quite a worry. And then you've got these kind of even wackier ideas that we're going to go, you pick your favorite technophile who says we're going to terraform Mars and create a new planet. And even if that was possible, which is not, frankly, in the next 100, 200, 300 years, how would you get 8 billion people up there, let alone all the 10 million species we've got? And, it just, the ethical implications of leaving a dying planet behind are massive. Or, downloading your brain into the metaverse so that we don't need bodies. Our bodies we're embodied, we need our bodies. Half the brain's in our gut, let alone in our brain. Not half, but a lot of our brain. Um, our consciousness relies on our senses and as a function of our environment. So it doesn't just make scientific sense that, you can't download who you are into a computer. The little thing on the bottom right is the book that Phoenix mentioned, I think, in the materials, which talks about some of these technofixes and not just technofixes, other kind of approaches. And I won't go into the economic fixes tonight, but this is another type of solutionism, command and control regulation. We see this planet Earth, isolated in space, and this thin biosphere, just so thin and so vulnerable. And maybe there's an urge to kind of protect that and think, well, okay, we need global governance, we need top down command and control regulation. So let's impose these sustainability targets. But even just some mild targets recently from the European Commission about reducing harmful pesticides and enabling more land for farmers led to these massive protests across Europe, in Paris, in Madrid, in Berlin, in London. And the problem is farmers are living on the breadline already in terms of their livelihoods. And so these small changes imposed top down, really threaten their livelihoods. So understandably, they get up and protest. And equally, net zero, it's very easy to see now a polarization and people pushing back about, this is taking away our freedoms. So we have to be very careful about bringing people along with us. It's like that union slogan, nothing about us without us. And people don't want to have these things imposed upon them. We need to collectively decide how we want to navigate this crisis and make those choices with our own agency. So these are some of the solutions that are, I'd say, kind of stick in plaster fixes. They're not really addressing the crisis effectively. I mean, just think about the geoengineering. Even if it did work, it's not really addressing all the CO2 that's going into the oceans. That would still be happening. And that CO2 makes the oceans more acid. And that means all the marine life that has any kind of shell dies. And that means all our marine ecosystems essentially start to struggle. So I'm going to move on a little bit now and just talk a bit more about where I see the sort of genuine solutions. And this is a kind of sort of systems thinking model here, this iceberg. You'll see at the top you have events. So these are things you see in the world. You read about them in the news every day. Let's say tomatoes are now 50% more expensive than they were, or cucumbers or whatever it is, And these price shocks will get worse and worse as the crisis continues. And we could say, okay, let's invent robotic pollinators because it's, partly caused by a pollinator crisis. But we said, that's not a full solution. We could go under that and say, well, what's causing the decline of, of these yields? And we could say, well, it's due to climate change, driving those impacts on soil health, driving the impacts on pollinators. Let's implement the geoengineering solutions to try and reduce climate change. But as we've seen, that's not really a deeper solution. But what underpins this is our mindsets and culture. This is why we're driving the climate crisis and air pollution and ocean acidification and nitrogen deposition and all these other environmental and interrelated social crises as well. And we could say it's our institutions that are kind of driving this. Like we're on this juggernaut, and it's our economy that's driving this destruction. It's our legal systems. It's the way we educate people. And underpinning those institutions are our mindsets, collectively, how we think, our relationships to each other and the natural world. And then those mindsets and collectively our culture form the institutions that have become, ecocidal. And if we want to change that ecocidal, society and those institutions, then we need to get right down to that level of mindset change. So this, idea of systems thinking has been around for a long time, and it's trying to get to those deeper leverage points. One of those in particular is how we see our identity, who we are. And in many Western countries, we've seen increases in individuality, this sense of kind of an individualistic culture, even to the extreme of kind of narcissistic culture. And it's complex. It's partly caused by how governments talk to us. Thatcher saying there's no such thing as society, only individuals and their families. It's to do with the way we educate our children. It's to do with advertising, a whole set of complex factors that drive this cultural shift. And we see it in the language that's used in books, in songs, etc. So the whole set of analysis underpinning this. And I deal with some of that in this previous book called The Self-Delusion, tracking this rise in individualistic culture and how it's actually, ultimately an illusion that we are separate and isolated and atomized, and a harmful illusion at that, which I'll come to shortly. But it's not just kind of fringe academics talking about this kind of, rise in individualism and the problems. This is a report by what's called IPBES. It's a very bit of a mouthful, Intergovernmental Platform for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. And this was set up with over 250 over 150 countries have ratified this latest report. So it's a bit like the IPCC is for climate. The IPBES was set up to understand what's happening with nature and what can we do about it. And you can see here this report talks about the change that we need is not just in terms of the structures or the practices, it's right down to the level of the views and the mindsets and the culture. And there are three main causes that they identify of the destruction of nature is disconnection from a domination over nature and people. It's a concentration of power and wealth, and it's prioritization of short-term individual and material gains. These are all things that are about our psychology, our philosophy, our mindset, and our culture. And even number two, I haven't put in bold because you could say, well, that's a bit more structural. It's about the economy. But how we run our economy, companies working for sort of the profit motive driven by shareholders, that's a choice, and that's to do with the mentality that we build into that system. So again, this is the IPBES talking about this kind of need for a deeper shift. But there's many different actors. I'm getting these lovely green trails through this slides. I'm not sure what's going on, but it's creative. But so in terms of these different quotes, I'm not going to read them all. And these are different actors. You've got the IPCC on the top right. You've got
Wow.
the UN Environment Programme. I'll just read the one on the middle left because, this is the IPBES again saying, pathways to sustainability, so tackling the climate and nature crisis, require shifts from broad values of individualism and economic profit to sustainability-aligned values of collectivism, care, and equality. So this is really talking about that kind of need for a deeper cultural shift. I've talked about, individualism, our kind of how we see ourselves in relation to other people, but it's also about how we see our relation to nature. And many different cultures don't see nature as an asset, as something that we can call a natural capital and hold at arm's length. They see it as part of us. And actually, the IPBES did an assessment on this, a values assessment, it was called, to understand the diverse ways that people see nature. Interestingly, the experts, as part of that assessment, were changed themselves and started to have a more plural view of nature, seeing it not just as something that's very instrumental, nature for people, but seeing us as part of nature, people as nature.
Mm.
And just to say, it's not these indigenous cultures around the world that hold on to this ancient, this wisdom that we are part of nature. Modern science kind of fully supports this. The cells in our body, we have 38 trillion bacteria in our body, the same number of our human cells. Even our human cells are formed from initial cells that engulf these tiny archaic bacteria that became the mitochondria that forms the energy the kind of power factories that allow our body to have energy. So we're kind of chimera of human and non-human. And in our brains, the 150 billion neurons that form our personalities are changing all the time in response to everything we've heard, every touch, every smell, the pheromones around us, both from other people and from nature and the trees and the animals around us, constantly rewiring that neural network, which forms essentially our personality. So, in the book here, the Self-Delusion book, it kind of talks about this science, and really, in a nutshell, there's nothing that we know in science, from cognitive neuroscience to cell biology to evolutionary biology, that says that we are separate, isolated, atomized individuals. As part of the web of life, our DNA is borrowed from others and we'll pass it on to ancestors to come. Our bodies are made from kind of materials scavenged from the environment that pass through us. Those materials were part of other bodies before us. And our brains are this kind of, our minds are porous and affected all the time by our environment around us. So just kind of moving on in terms of, okay, I've talked about this idea of interconnectedness, how important our identity is, our mindset of interconnectedness, but also, scaled up of the culture, what that means in terms of our culture. This talk is obviously about climate change and climate adaptation. And the reason this is so important is if we have this sense of interconnectedness, that I see myself as part of other people, as part of nature, one is it avoids unfair private adaptation. So private adaptation is when we see, okay, we know there's a crisis coming, there's water shortages or there's air pollution, etc. If you're wealthy enough, you can secure your own private water resources. You can air condition your luxury apartment. You can air condition your vehicle. And actually, if we're all pretty selfish and living in a wealthy elite, this is how things will happen and are happening. But you can see the kind of ethical implications of that. And that diminishes when we see ourselves as part of a common humanity. The second aspect is systems thinking. Now, I've talked about understanding those complex risks, which is what we need to do to kind of navigate this polycrisis. And I won't go into it now, but there's lots of science really showing that when you have this systems thinking capacity, sorry, when you have this sense of interconnection, because if you think about it, if you see yourself as atomized and everything in the world as a sort of separate object, you're not really thinking about relationships. But when you see the relations between things and you see how we are part of other entities and we see those relationships, what we're doing is systems thinking. And that means that we're better then at understanding these complex risks. If I buy a product, the impacts of that purchase potentially ripple across the world and impact, rainforest ecosystems on the other side of the world. They impact peatlands, etc. So understanding that sense of interconnectedness is a key requisite for systems thinking. The other aspect is about care and social responsibility. And here's just a sort of counterexample. If we see ourselves as isolated, atomized individuals, it's kind of not, here's some science, on the screen, but it's pretty obvious in a way that if we have this sense of isolation, we're going to feel lonely and anxious, and we're going to have apathy, and we're not going to be able to do much to respond to the climate crisis, and we're not going to care much about others either. So really, there's this strong links between that sense of social connectedness and cohesion and our capacity to deal with the crisis. And then the last point leads to pro-environmental behaviors and restore nature. So, I mean, if you have a look at this, it's a one-question survey. Where would you see yourself in terms of your relationship with nature? Who you are and nature. Is it A, completely separate, or D and E kind of more overlapping? So have a think, where you would put yourself. And the interesting outcome from this is that where you put yourself determines how you act. And if you're in a category sort of D or E, you're more likely to recycle, you're more likely to reduce your carbon footprint, you're more likely to volunteer for environmental causes. These aren't just single papers, these are what are called meta-analyses. They're synthesis of hundreds of papers now, which have realized that when people see themselves as connected with nature, they do more to care for the planet. And it doesn't matter which survey you use, this one question one or any of these other indices, they kind of do the same thing. So in that sense, I've kind of whizzed through this quite quickly, but there's a strong scientific case here for why an interconnected sense of identity is crucial for our ability to deal with the climate crisis. So those are the kind of some of the key reasons that I talked about. And so the last part of the talk, I want to cover an example of adaptation from a project that we worked in Reading with some collaborators around the world, and then linking this back to this kind of culture shift as well, if I may. So there's quite a lot on these slides. The next sort of 3 slides is kind of quite condensed, but this was a project called Empower, and had three pilots, or it was a pilot using the same method in 3 countries. In the UK, we did it in Oxford, in Wallingford, and Reading. In India, we did it in the Assam region, which is a region which is really poor and susceptible to uh, flooding from the river, and that means people live these kind of livelihoods that are just on the edge, and they keep having to move, and the flooding is getting worse. And in Ghana as well, in the Lower Volta region, we also carried out this study. In the UK, it was done with a self-selecting audience, so it was done online in sort of virtual workshops. But in India and Ghana, it was done in kind of community village halls. And that, I'll come on to why that's important, because I think in the UK, we're probably speaking a bit more to the converted by, asking people who are interested in climate change to come along. And one of the challenges is getting people to care and to think about the importance of this. So what we did in a nutshell, the bottom left here is how it works, that you develop these systems maps. And we did this in a way which we're not, scientists telling these people, these citizens how it is. We want them to think about the climate crisis themselves. So we provide some minimal information, just saying, okay, for your region, this is what might happen to flood risk in different areas. This is what might happen to the number of extreme weather days, etc. But then the group comes together, and this was a kind of online systems mapping workshop in the UK, and in Ghana and India, it was on paper. In the middle, the tiny little red box you can see there is essentially me, my family, and my community. And what we're saying is, okay, can people start to map on the ways that climate change will affect them and their family and their community? And it's not just the direct impacts of flooding, of heat wave, heat stress on buildings, etc. It's also things like food system disruption. Can they buy food? What will happen to their energy costs? What happens if their transport to get to work is disrupted from wildfires? We get them to think outside the box. So the facilitators are kind of prompting them to think about all those different angles. And they start to plot, okay, how will, wildfires disrupt me and my family and community? And then what they do in the green boxes, oh, sorry, the yellow boxes here, is start to plot interventions. And these are things that they can do to sort of start to reduce those impacts. So you might be affected by, the buildings getting very hot with the climate, warming. So maybe you could plant a tree on the south side facing garden of your house. Maybe you think about investing in shutters, etc. Paint your walls white, ultimately. So what we did is we then looked at those interventions, we fleshed them out a bit, what they would do. We brought them back in a second workshop to the participants. They talked about them with each other. Some of the participants had done these things, and so they shared knowledge, saying, "Oh yeah, I did get flood barriers on my house. I use this company. They were terrible. Don't use them. Use someone else." So it's the sharing that local knowledge, and then people make a decision about what they'd like to do, and then they develop a personal adaptation plan. So that's kind of on the right here, this personal adaptation plan. It kind of ultimately says what they decided they'd like to do, when they're going to do it in the next 3 months, in the next 6 months, and what they're going to do, etc. The figure on the left here is just one of the outcomes of the UK study, which I'll kind of talk through. The different plots are different kind of types of intervention. So the top one is about what you can do to kind of, I guess, influence upwards. So essentially, it's easy to say, "Oh God, there's flooding in my village. It's the Environment Agency. They need to do more." But we try to phrase these things in terms of empowerment and agency. So what can you do if the Environment Agency is not doing enough? Could you write to them? Could you write to your MP? Could you mobilize people to protest? So that's what this part is about. And the greens are things that people are already doing this. And the oranges, people wanting to do it in the future, and the dark oranges, they don't want to do it. And if they don't want to do it, maybe there's a good reason. They don't have time, but in some cases it might not be relevant. So here, the plot below, you can see flood barriers. Well, if you don't live in a flood zone, it's not really relevant for you. So there's reasons why you might not choose to do it, or you might not own your house. That's a common one. You can't put flood barriers in because you don't own the property. So that ownership came up in several ones of these cases. So these are the things, the second row now is what you can do in your house, put insulation in, trees in your garden, ventilation, etc. And then you've got what you can do to improve your food security and what you can do to improve your energy security. Part of what the analysis was doing as well was looking at trade-offs, because obviously, and this was an example from Ghana, I think, the one we've got here in the middle, is if you're thinking about outcomes, there are certain things that might have trade-offs. Just going back to the UK, houses getting very hot in the climate crisis, people start, now buying air conditioning. Now, obviously, a trade-off is that uses a lot of energy, which costs you a lot of money, but also directly is driving climate change as well. So obviously, the trade-off between adaptation and mitigation of climate change there is quite stark. Similarly, sometimes there's trade-offs with nature. It can be a positive trade-off, but it can be a co-benefit. So co-benefit, you plant a tree in your south-facing garden, it keeps your house cool, but also it provides a habitat for birds and food for insects, etc. So it's a co-benefit that you can benefit other things you care about as well. So that's important. Again, it comes back to this systems thinking. You're not just thinking with a narrow siloed lens. You're trying to think about what are all the things I care about and how can I make sure that, addressing all of them and not making progress on one, but adversely burden shifting to the other problem. And just a final slide on this project, really. We did some evaluation. It would have been nice to go back a year, 2 years later with those adaptation plans and say, well, did you do the things that you said you were going to do? But we didn't actually have, resources for that in this short, it was a 1 year project and a real sprint. But what we did do is go to participants and say, okay, do you feel more aware of climate impacts now? Do you feel in the way that it's going to affect you and your family? Do you feel more prepared? So we did a before and after survey. And you can see here that the awareness of climate change impacts and the preparedness increased in all the pilots. Um, and so really this is kind of focusing, as you said, on this very much sort of bottom up community level planning for adaptation. Yes, government is doing stuff, but citizens really need to kind of mobilize and do as much as they can. Um, I'm going to skip that. I'm going to come back to it if there's a bit of time in the discussion. But the last part here, I've covered these parts, and I just want some sort of final thoughts because I mentioned that Empower project, and in the India and Ghana, it was done in village halls with the whole community, with the community elders were coming and gathering people together. And actually, those communities have a lot of cohesion. They have a strong interconnected sense of identity, a strong interconnected culture. In the UK, we've lost that. We're one of the countries that is there's least connected to nature when these psychological surveys, and we have quite a low sense of kind of connection of each other in many of our communities now. That's not all. That's not to say that, of course, in many cases we're building that, but broadly, and if the case in many cities, people live quite atomized lives. So how do we change that culture to create that sense of community, that sense of interconnection, so that projects like Empower, which is just a pilot, but schemes like that, or whatever kind of adaptation project, or the climate emergency centers, how do we get that kind of momentum behind those? And so the culture shift is a key kind of precursor to that as well. So one of the other projects we've been doing at Reading, and you've heard Marzia, my colleague, talk about this last week actually, was this project called Catalyst for Nature-Centric Awareness and Governance. And here, nature-centric awareness is this sense of connection, being aware that we are part of nature. But it correlates very well with a sense of being connected to other people as well. So I talk sometimes about nature connection, but equally you can talk about social connectedness. And if you measure those two things, they tend to be quite correlated. And we're interested in, okay, how do we shift the dial on that? How do we make people feel more connected to each other and to nature? And luckily, there's a whole range of evidence out there. And these are just some seminal references of different fields. Taking people out in nature, doing these amazing interventions where children spend time in woodlands, etc., forest bathing, forest schools. Meditation is really known to down-regulate this default mode network in our brain, which is responsible for kind of self-rumination and ultimately a feeling of loneliness and anxiety. And even some technologies can help us. I don't think technology is all the answer. And I've talked about the problem of some of these techno fixes, but technology is a key part of our humanity. And there is evidence of things like some apps, for example, where it asks you to notice 3 nice, good things in nature today. And that's been shown to link to a sense of nature connection and well-being and connectedness. And also cognitive intervention, so reading, writing. So here's some of these interventions, just some images. And the big question is, like, I showed you some seminal references there. And interestingly, there, I have to go back, these are kind of all working in different academic fields. So some of it is neuroscience, some of it is environmental psychology, some of it is in tech. But actually, they're not really brought together, and they're not brought together in any meaningful way in kind of any kind of policy, whether that's government policy or kind of, even, third sector type policy. There's some great things going on, like the RSPB and the Wildlife Trust have schemes to get children connecting with nature. 30 days wild, get them doing different activities. They measure before and after this sense of nature connectedness. Even as part of my book, I did a before and after measure for nature connectedness and social connectedness. And fiction books change our perspective on who we are. And then there's the meditation and the tech. So can these be brought together in a kind of evidence-based developmental pathway where we kind of refine the offering over time and we kind of create this cultural shift? So we can do it in a way which is not sort of haphazard, but we can learn what's the best way to kind of, shift this dial so that we challenge this anthropocentric bias where we see ourselves as separate, isolated as humans from the rest of nature. We challenge this individualistic bias, and we help people to kind of, think about that development. So there's a paper here by my colleague Matt and some others on this project where we kind of talk about these different interventions, the evidence behind them, but also the idea that maybe they could be brought together in a kind of evidence-based way of creating this inner change. So I think that's it. I feel like I've really whizzed through that, but I kind of wanted to kind of give you a bit of a primer on some of the different elements there. And obviously, it was sort of focusing initially on those systemic risks and the kind of complex polycrisis we faced, and how governments are starting to wake up to that. But really, as communities, we also need to do that. And there's techniques to think about systems thinking, but there's also these elements of just basic human culture about who we are and our relationship with each other and nature, which is so important in terms of catalyzing that motivation to act. So I'll end there, and hopefully, nice to hear from other people. I guess question I have is, what schemes are going on where people are doing these kind of projects which shift that, community culture, because I'm sure there's absolutely loads going on that we could learn from as well. And so I'd like to hear about that or any questions you've got. Um, I've sent to Phoenix before a kind of set of resources. The paper I mentioned on Empower is published, unfortunately, in a journal which is closed access. So to subvert that, I've put a Google folder. You can go in there and you can access the PDF for free. There's also an online version at Reading. We make all our papers open access anyway, but you don't get the nice formatting from the journal. So if you want the journal version, it's in the Google folder. And there's a few other bits that I've talked about in there, like the country level reports, etc. So I'll end there. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Tom. That was really, really informative. You got a big new fan club on the chat there. A few different people saying, brilliant and intelligent person bring it all together for us, particularly on the the interconnections of all peoples and nature, and not being separated. I thought that was fantastic. And I'm really, really glad you're bringing up solutions. Really glad we're talking about culture. We talk about system change a lot, and I think Jen has a phrase about we talk about strategy a lot, but I think the phrase, what was it, that culture eats strategy for breakfast. If our entire culture changes, then it's much bigger than strategies, and what you're talking about is cultural shifts and cultural changes in the way we completely look at things, how companies are run, how our systems are run, what we live within and how we describe it. So thank you very much for that. Really, really important. Great to hear about the National Risk Register, and we need to have all these things brought in together. I think we've got a few questions there. We did ask for either hands or put the question in the Q&A box. I think Sue had a question in the Q&A box. I might just go to that first because she did use that. Sue, and then Diane, and then Dottie,
Oh,
and then Dan.
just a second. Let me just make sure I've let people unmute themselves. I'm sorry.
All right, so
Goodness.
while you're doing that, Dottie, Sue in Wallingford, I think you got your hand up there, but you did put something in the Q&A box. So
Yeah.
Sue had a
Okay.
question
There we
for
go.
you, and then Diane, I think Dottie, and then Dave Taylor. Over to you, Sue. Great to see you.
Doctor, I've turned my video off and it's saying that you're not letting me turn
You
it
can now. You can now.
on. Right.
Turn it on again. There we go. Brilliant.
Yeah, this is a bit of a wild card question, I suppose. We ran the emergency briefing on Sunday. You came to it, Tom, in Wallingford. And here's a shout out to the emergency briefing. I think it's just such a fantastic, clever idea because it just gets everybody involved in things, and it was really, really positive. I'm going to speak devil's advocate now, and the two devils are a businessman who's not been to anything like that before, and my husband, who both came back and said, do we really need nature to survive? Could we manage without? Could we have little robotic pollinators and then eat grasses because they don't have to be pollinated, and already on our chalk hills there's no soil, and so the stuff that's being grown on our chalk hills is already done by hydroponics. Really, add just add water and fertilizer and so on.
So I think you're being slightly mischievous to asking a kind of slightly rhetorical question, because I mean, of course, ultimately we can't live without nature. I mean, to some degree, we've lost a lot of nature, as you know, that we've, you know, even our meadows, lowland meadows in the UK, we've kind of 97% are lost, and yet we're still here. And so sometimes it's hard for people to see, well, okay, well, it still looks green and pleasant, even though we know that, you know, behind the scenes we're losing insect biodiversity, we're losing birds, farmland birds, etc. But it's kind of those arguments about, you know, people talk about, well, Paul Ehrlich talked about an aeroplane. Like if you keep taking rivets out the aeroplane, you know, it seems to fly okay, but at some point it's going to fall out the sky. Now, we don't know how quickly that collapse could be. And so people talk about a pollinator crisis. I personally, that's a slow burn crisis compared to some of the other issues we face around soil health decline and mass human migration disrupting, you know, civil society and economic systems, etc. So, you know, each of these sub crises has a sort of rate that we can look at. I think ultimately, you know, we know the direction we're going is a kind of end game in a way that as we degrade the environment and we get these social collapse, you know, yes, to some degree, we can have this fortress world where we live in this, the rich people will do okay for a while. You know, food prices will become catastrophic, but rich people will be able to do well, and rich countries relatively will be able to do well for a while. We'll see our diversity of food types go down. Ultimately, you could even say, well, you know, maybe we could grow food underground in precision fermentation vats with solar panels as energy. But, you know, we really wouldn't survive for that long as this gets worse and worse and our quality of life goes down and down. So it feels like, you know, how far do we want to push it? I think we're starting to see that the whole system's starting to crack. And, you know, most people on this call are probably pretty awake to that. And I think it's you know, like the emergency briefing film, but also I think Marzia put one in the chat, Nature Positive, which maybe she could put in the chat again, is a really impressive film about this global destruction that we're wreaking. And yeah, I mean, I won't talk for too long, Sue, but I think, you know, yeah.
My comeback would be, why would you want to live in a world without nature?
Exactly, yeah.
Not can you, but why would you want to?
Okay, that's a good point. So just to say, we've got quite a few hands up. So if everyone can keep their
Jess Farr's put a Q&A in the
Sorry, sorry, Dottie, just that. Diane, if you want to go for your question, then Dave Taylor, then Helen.
Okay.
Keep them short and focused, guys.
As quick as possible, because I haven't actually got a question. I just want to say thank you, a massive, massive thank you, because you put it all in such a little lovely nutshell. I mean, how can you live without nature when we are nature? That is about the education thing. We all need to know we are part of nature. Everything we do affects everything on the rest of the planet. We're not just our little bubble in England here, blah, blah, blah. I also wanted to say thank you for part of the pictures it fits in with donut economics. It's done as donutty things, so that if the education that we as a group, a massive worldwide group, are going, then we can recognize those pictures and see what they mean. And I want to finish off with hopefully to inspire you in return that actually that movement is happening. There's lots going on. There are so many people who are doing the real thing. And 10 minutes just before this webinar started, I was watching a 53-second link from somebody else's thing, actually talking about acupuncture, that if you use an acupuncture needle, it affects everything and everybody, and love is like the acupuncture needle. So all we have to do is pray for the rest of the planet or send love. What I said to my friend who walked in while I was watching it, I shower you with love. That in turn will shower me with love, and that way we all shower everybody with love, and we'll save the world.
Spread the love, spread the love. Thank you, Diane.
Yeah,
Lovely. Then Dave Taylor, then Helen Hart.
Thank you for inviting me to this. It's been absolutely brilliant. Unfortunately, I live in Walsall in the West Midlands, and we live in one of the most deprived areas in Walsall, and it's in the bottom 1% of deprivation in the UK. And climate change is low on people's priorities at the moment because they're trying to keep a roof over their head and food in the belly. We're showing the film on the 4th of July, but another we've been doing a lot with climate change. We've got a retrofit project. We've got a climate and energy project that we're doing. But one of the things that's set us back is we've now got, out of our 60 local councillors, we've now got 40 who are reform, and they've already come out and said they're going to rip up the Walsall Council net zero plan, and anything to do with net zero they're not going to communicate with. So we are leading. We've got a little charity. It's a little independent charity. We've saved people £1 million on their energy bills. We've prevented thousands of tons of CO2 from entering the atmosphere, but we're getting that much pushback now from reform councillors, and they're putting things in the media saying, "Oh well, net zero is costing you loads of money on your energy bills, and this, that, and the other." It's really difficult, and I was just wondering what. And I'm really a strong believer that we've got to do this from the bottom up and not from the top down. It's got to be led by the community.
Very good, Dave. Yeah, it has to bring in social justice and the cost of living crisis, and be speaking to everyone. So, Tom, have you got a few bits on that? And then we got quite a few questions.
No, I think I mean it's a real challenge, isn't it? And I think just one thing to say, I think, is that yeah, if net zero is imposed, as I mentioned, sort of, and it's it's made to look top down, then people will reject it, especially with the kind of right wing sort of reform kind of misinformation campaigns. So I think it's very important to try to speak to people about why it's important to them about the climate crisis. Ultimately, it will cost us a lot more if we don't act on the climate crisis. And I think people who are more right wing care about their families and their communities as well, and they also triggered much more by issues around security. So to talk about the security of your local community and what you can do is maybe a way in to start having that community and that bottom up action, rather than it's very challenging with the right wing media kind of pushing buttons around xenophobia, around kind of why net zero is a bad idea, etc. So we have to somehow combat that, and I think bottom up community led initiatives and thinking about our messaging, that we're not just focusing on the left but also the right, because we're all people and we all care. So
very good, Tom. And I was really glad to see Tom talking about community led. It was one of the early language for the climate emergency centres, that they are community led, focused on solutions and what does that actually look like. We need to have more where people can share knowledge with each other, feed into the council, into government, and put our ideas in. Over to Helen and then Richard, and if we can keep our questions focused short. Tom, have you got till 5 past or 10 past?
Yeah, I don't have a hard stop. Yeah,
we'll go till 10 past. Yeah, we do. And just because it's popular tonight with 76 an hour or something. Helen and then Richard, focused questions.
Yeah, so my comment was going to be similar to Dave's. We've got Wakefield Council down the road who are doing exactly the same, getting rid of net zero policies. We need to think very, very, very hard about our terminology, because net zero, it's not that easy to understand what it means. It's easy to mistranslate it for we're going to stop everything rather than working on it. The same, the keeping it below 1 degrees, 1.5 degrees does not make sense until you've really looked into it, because you think, it'll just be like living on the Costa del Sol. And near the end, that thing where you were talking about the strategies and doing things like forest bathing and meditation, well, nah. I've been in this sort of space for a dozen years or so, and I still cringe when people start going off on meditation and love and that sort of thing. I want practical, I want fact-based, and you are just going to turn people off if you say, we can save the world, but you have to come and meditate with us.
The different strokes for different folks, but one of the key points that Helen's making and others is it has to be accessible language.
Yeah.
We need to be people don't understand as much net zero. Sometimes we have to be talking about pollution. We have to be talking about the cost of living crisis, and we use language that everyone campaign for plain English that everyone can link in with. But that's a good one, Helen. Thank you.
I also just think that we need to say that some of the net zero policies are shit. Burning trees at Drax is supposed to be net zero. It's a con. So we need to kind of link in that, well, yeah, that part's true. Yeah, I don't know.
Question, and good to look at, look at all things. Over to Richard or Tom. Tom, did you want anything there, or over to Richard?
No, I think I just agree that we have to think of our messaging for our audience. And when I go into the secondments in government, I wear a suit and I don't talk about meditation, but I talk about national security and prosperity, etc. But I also do focus on some of the science about the need for mindset and culture change. And there's strong evidence base underpinning this. And so we've had a lot of workshops around these ideas of nature-centric governance, which depending on how you might present them, they might sound a bit fluffy, but actually there's a lot of evidence behind them. But completely get the message too that we kind of need to think about our audience carefully.
All right, guys. Thank you, Tom. So we've got a few more questions queuing up. Just please keep them focused for the time we have, guys. Think about your question before you go in there. Richard Harding in Wallingford, and then
hopefully a quick question. Yeah, we need to obviously bottom up, but we also need top down. And you walk the corridors of power. We had the emergency briefing, the big one where there are 1,000 odd policymakers there. But in your opinion, but we're still chasing GDP and we're still heading towards this precipice. Do the policy makers really get it? And do they get it but feel paralyzed by the financial system? So this is a big question, I know, but what is the block that's stopping the economists and the policymakers actually grasping the nettle here?
That's a really challenging question. I think that kind of idea of, what are the barriers, what are the lock-ins that are preventing us shifting this big, government system in terms of how it works, or the economy, etc. And I mean, we did some analysis of food systems, why we locked into the way the food system operates in a way which is destroying nature, even though that we know that if we keep on with that, we won't have a food system and we won't have a civilization. And we came up with about 18 different sort of lock-in mechanisms, and some were to do with economics, and some were to do with sort of socio-cultural factors. The way we see ourselves, the way we have a belief in techno fixes, and so there's a lot there, Richard, I suppose, in terms of that. I do, in terms of just the original question about top down and bottom up. I think a lot of governments are now starting to do the top down, but haven't really realized that it's not going to work, because people aren't just going to have there's such big changes we need that they have to have permission and democratic legitimacy from the population. And so we're already seeing the pushback from net zero and from those EU policies I mentioned, and then government pulls back. So I think what we really need is, where the bottom up and the top down comes together, and government would facilitate a whole range of citizen assemblies that then they act upon. And I think, we just haven't had the courage yet. Maybe if they feel like they'll lose power, but we've had citizen assemblies in France that did lead to some, not perfect, but some good policies. And I think that would be a good move forward. But there's a lot more on that question, Richard. Maybe we can chat it over some time over the next time.
That's a big one. One of the parts of the CEC round of strategies, we'd like to see all of the different centres having people's assemblies digitally linked up. We need these conversations going on at all levels of society cooperating. Gavin, then Dottie, then Jessie. Dottie, then Jenny, then Jess Farr. Please, we've got 10 minutes left with Tom's precious time. Let's keep them focused. Gavin, then Dottie.
Thank you, Tom. I've really appreciated your talk. A lot of information there. I've put something in the post in the chat, which I'd just like to read out. I've written that with great power comes great responsibility, but with no power comes no responsibility. The empowered are insufficiently responsible, and the responsible are insufficiently empowered. I very much believe in mind shift and meditation and so on. But the fear is that we change our minds, but we don't have any power. In a world which is hugely imbalanced, where 1% or 2% own nearly 50% of the world's resources, there's a sense that there is very little that the majority can do. We feel powerless. And I think
Yeah.
this needs to be addressed if we're going to really make meaningful change.
Nice.
Yeah, really good points, Gavin. So I think, yeah, it's often the case if we start talking about kind of inner change and in that kind of mindsets culture that people say, well, yeah, but it's the kind of shell executives that we that are causing the problem. It's the big institutional factors, and that's true. I mean, like those CEOs, MPs, etc. Are just people, and we can influence. Their mindsets can be influenced, and in the longer term, children growing up, they are the CEOs and the politicians of the future. So education is hugely important here. So I think there's an element there that yes, getting down to that deeper level of who we are it sounds like a bit slow. This is a crisis, but I like the saying, this is an emergency. We need to slow down because if we're running off in the wrong direction with all these sticking plaster fixes, and we have been, the last 25 years in conservation has been treating nature as an asset and a natural capital and monetizing it with a kind of slightly misguided view that it would sort everything out if we can just mesh it into our economic system. And we don't need to change who we are, but that would sort everything. And it hasn't worked. And I think, we rather than running off in the wrong directions, focusing on the genuine solutions, I think is key. It's not just I have some slides in this talk which I didn't cover, but it's about how that mindset culture change cascades up to change institutions. And Marzia last week talked about legislation, rights of nature, I think, and the other economic changes we might see. The donut economics was mentioned. When these ideas for how to run a legal system or economy come from a very different place, a different philosophy about our relationship with each other and nature, then we can see some very different ways of cascading up to those bigger sort of institutional factors. So I think, yeah, I agree with your point. There's a big job to do. But I still stick to my guns that, we need to get right down to the bottom of that iceberg first before we come back up.
Yeah.
Okay, very good. So coming over, bottom up to top down, all meet in the middle. Dottie and Jenny, then Jess. Keep your answers focused, questions and answers focused. Dottie.
So I had first thing I was thinking of asking Tom is what how interrelated is your work with the work of people like the Nature-Based Solutions Initiative at Oxford and which is under Natalie Seddon, and also the work of writers like David Abrams, who I'm hoping to come and get to do a webinar with us at some point in the future. So that's one quick thing. And then the second thing I was going to ask was about connectedness to nature and how to get people from different ethnicities and backgrounds and minorities, disadvantaged people. I've just quickly looked up the stats to back up this question, which is that 26% of black people in the UK spend time in nature compared to 44% of white individuals. And of course, the white individuals doesn't break that down by class, and neither does the black. But so that's another thing, because I think that probably works into what you've got to say. And the final thing was you posted up a lot of things about connectivity potentials, how you could go across this. Get this happening, and there was quite a few things mentioning things like VR, and I just wondered how you squared the circle with those kind of things. So I'm not against it. I just wondered if maybe you could kind of speak to why you think that's allowable and why that doesn't fit into techno-optimistic stuff.
Okay, no, so I'll answer those quickly. Yeah, so nature-based solutions. Yes, I gave a talk at the Levium Centre in Oxford. And I work a bit with Natalie Seddon there. And I was making the case that, nature-based solutions, maybe we need to think about human nature-based solutions. And, that it's, yes, we have focused in conservation at that kind of more technical level without thinking so much about the human and people as much. So I think that is changing now. And I think the whole Levium Centre at Oxford, the Levium Centre for Nature Recovery, is shifting its focus a bit more down to this level around, the people and our kind of relationship with nature. And Nat is leading a charity called I Stand Beside, which is about advocating for people to pick a species to stand beside. And myself and Mutzi have been working with Natalie on the charity, as trustees on that. In terms of the VR one, I mean, yeah, we've just finished a book chapter which was talking about the kind of pros and cons of technology in linking people with nature. And I think I'd sit on the very skeptical side as well. I think there's so many opportunity costs and associated energy, etc. costs that we need to think about. And then underrepresented communities, yeah, absolutely. There's a nice charity in Reading called Nature Nurture, just a film showing yesterday. It's called Transition Town Reading, if people wanted to look it up. And Nature Nurture take underrepresented groups into nature to build that nature connection. So I think, yeah, definitely trying to groups that actively try to address that bias. It's a very important aspect.
Thank you for that. Jenny's got a very good question, system change, I think, there. And then Jess for final question. Well done, Tom, for fielding.
I posted some stuff in the chat actually because I want to say this. I used to work in OD in organizations, and an area I liken it to a magician. You have to keep all the plates spinning. Doesn't matter who thinks what, whether they're with you or against you, you've got to be spinning them all the time. You've got to notice if they're dropping and keep doing that magician trick. We cannot say it's not top down or it's bottom up. I think we just have to play everything all at the same time. Energize it as much as we can. And there is no quick fix to this lot. I've been doing this since the 70s, you know. We have a great momentum now, but let's keep that open mind. And also, there is no, I think you said different stuff for different folks, you know, everybody is different. I'm a psychotherapist, I'm a biologist, I'm a few things actually, but we can never be anybody else's shoes, and we never know what is going to turn them on or turn them off at any one point. We just have to go for it and be aware that everybody is different, and we're trying to get as many people as possible in this. And then my other aspect to this is I'm a gardener, and my garden is drying up. You know, we don't get rain for a day and it's dry as the bone. What's that about? I think I'm not seeing a huge amount about what plants to grow for the future.
Yeah. Okay.
Because we need to keep the climate going. We need to be churning the carbon and all that stuff. But how do we do that now?
Yeah. I mean, on the first point, Jenny, thanks. I completely agree. I put the link to that food systems paper in the chat because when we talk about those different factors that lock in the food system, we're very careful to say we need to work on all of them together. And so, you know, there's economic factors, perverse subsidies. We pay farmers to farm the way they do. We've got to address that. But there's socio-cultural things about how people have a belief in techno fixes. You know, we've got to address that. There are ones around knowledge deficits and, you know, the labeling of impacts of food products in terms of their embedded water, carbon, nature impacts. We've got to address that. So it takes all sorts of solution that we need to work on together. I often think a bit like as an ecologist, if you have it's a very ecologist analogy, like an insect stuck on your jumper, and then you get a couple of legs off, but then the two other legs have got stuck back on. You need to get all 6 legs off together. And it's like that. We have to work on all those leverage points together. And it takes different type of people. So you've got the people who do the meditation and the forest bathing, and you've got the people who wear suits and talk about nature-related risk in the finance industry and climate-related risk. And we need all those angles. So I think you're definitely a role for everyone. And we can't do it all as well. So, you know,
we also have amazing stuff going on with technology and AI, and there's, you know, we have a lot of resistance to it, yeah, but it can do amazing things. Yeah. And we're not dead yet, you know, and I don't
as for the plants,
you know.
Yeah. As for the plants, I don't know. I mean, yeah, there's plenty of gardeners out there, maybe on the call, who probably know about drought resilient plants, you know, etc.
But we need to be going that way, you know. We need,
yes, absolutely.
And agriculture.
There's a colleague of Tom's that I live with the community, and they're researching drought-resistant plans now at university, but we all need to work on these plants. Over to Jess Farr, who's been waiting patiently for, I think, the last question, and we'll give a quick shout for the convergence, and then Tom's summaries. Jess, last question over University Challenge.
Quite the responsibility. I was just wondering about So I noticed, thanks by the way, this is really so interesting. Um, I just noticed that the project that you were discussing was around resilience building, and that's something that's happening a lot in my area at the moment. And sometimes I worry a bit about that mitigation action is lost a little bit when we focus so much on resilience. And I was just interested to hear your thoughts on how to build mitigation into resilience work, really.
I think that's a really good point. I think internationally there was a big focus on mitigation, trying to avoid getting to 1.5 and we're almost pretty much there now. But I think the dial has started to shift when we've seen that, despite everything we've tried to do, that CO2 emissions is just notching up and up and up. And COVID, it went down a tiny little part and then it came back up. It's resilient, but it's undesirable resilience in that sense. It's a system that we just can't seem to shift. And so a lot of international policymakers have shifted now to a focus on adaptation with the recognition that we are going to get some pretty severe impacts. But you're equally right, we shouldn't give up the game and we need to address mitigation as well. So, and I think, sometimes there's trade-offs. Buying aircon is not a great solution to adapting your house when it's going to make the crisis worse in the longer term for other generations as well. But things like nature-based solutions, restoring nature is really a win-win in the sense that it is key for securing carbon and reducing further emissions, but it's also key for reducing flooding, improving public health, etc., and also just for being surrounded by nature and have that sense of joy and wonder that then gives us, motivation to kind of live and enjoy life. So to me, nature is a real key part of where it sits right in the middle, and we can continue to work on both. I mean, there are some forums, aren't there, sort of deep adaptation forum, where it's very much a focus on like the game is over, all adaptation. I've mentioned, too much mitigation, we kind of miss the ball in terms of keeping people safe. So I think keeping those two things in mind is hugely important. And for me, nature is really central to that.
Well,
thank you, Jeff.
thank you so much, Tom. We'll come over to you for drawing final summaries together. But, you really showed us I think one of the key things we really need to do, we're talking about system change and cultural change, is question the systems and the cultures we are within and how we actually assume things about our separation from nature or our connection to nature and each other. And that is really, really important and vital questions. We are in a system that rewards profit and consumerism to the point where there is a polluted air and water supply, and look at the word consuming until you have consumed the entire planet's resources. So we really need to look at how we change these things, and I think you've really illustrated tonight for us to question that. We are connected to nature, or one big energy field, experiencing ourselves as each other. So thank you so much for coming. I'll pass over to you for kind of summaries, anything you want to share, and really informative, great debate and discussion tonight. And hope to see some people at the Climate Emergency Centre Network Convergence. I've put something in the chat just there. We're meeting this weekend. Some of the 34 odd centres, about 15 of them coming from around the country to share knowledge about what it's been like to reuse vacant property for the last 3 to 20 years, setting up different eco-centre projects, reaching out on the high street, talking about community-led solutions of all varieties that exist. Over to you, Tom, for parting comments and summary. Thank you so much for coming.
Well, no, thanks so much for the invite. And I mean, I won't try and sort of summarize, and the discussion's been fascinating. And I want to have a look at the chat as well. I mean, if people are free to contact me by email if there's more questions. But I think, really, I'm keen to learn as well, because as we said, there's so many different facets of solutions that we need to be pursuing, and we can't all each do all of them, but between us all, people have expertise in different areas, and it's great to sort of coordinate as you do, Phoenix, and understand what's going on and where the gaps are. So keen to engage with people further, and I'll be there at the convening on Saturday, so maybe see some people in person. And thank you again for the invite.
All right, fantastic, folks, and thank you everyone very much for coming. We'll stop it there. There is usual 10 minutes chat afterwards, so thank you very much, everyone. What a fantastic one. Just stop the recording there, I think. There we go. Brilliant.